The China in Africa podcast is brought to you in partnership with the Africa-China Reporting Project at Wits University in Johannesburg. The ACRP aims to improve the quality of reporting on Africa-China relations through reporting grants, workshops, and other opportunities for journalists. More information at africachinareporting.co.za and our dedicated training website at africachinatraining.com.
Hello and welcome to our final episode of the China in Africa podcast for the year 2021. I'm Eric Olander, and as always, I'm joined by Cobus van Staden, the senior China-Africa researcher at the South African Institute of International Affairs in Johannesburg, South Africa. A very good afternoon to you, Cobus.
Good afternoon.
Cobus, we've been on vacation this week. We have a big year coming up. We're a little bit tired from the year that's been, so we're catching our breath. But as promised, we wanted to deliver our final show of the year, and as we've been doing for the past 10 years, we do our year in review, year in preview show, where we pick 3 topics from the year that was, and we pick one topic of what we expect to come in 2022, and we go through it. Now, as we've done in past years, we don't know what the others' topics are, so there may be some overlap, but we'll probably have different takes on it. We also don't put them in any priority of any kind. These are just 3 topics that we think are important for what happened. But before we get to our year in review, we have to talk about Trevor Noah and The Daily Show, because this was a punch to the gut as far as I'm concerned. It was called a segment, Why China is in Africa. If you don't know, now you know. On the actual thumbnail, it said China is colonizing Africa. And Cobus, when this came out, it really just sent shockwaves through the community that we're a part of in terms of scholars and analysts and journalists who follow this. And it really felt like it was just so depressing, because we expect more from Trevor Noah. This is a guy who's always brought nuance and an alternative way of looking at issues that's been smart, that's been witty, oftentimes funny. This segment was dumb, poorly informed, and really not very funny. And I think it was just very depressing for a lot of us in the Africa-China watching community.
Yeah, there was a lot of misinformation in this segment. He managed to pack in, kind of like wrong talking points left and right. It was quite dismaying. I have to admit, I've never been a massive fan, even during his South African stand-up days. I know it's a kind of a bad thing for a South African to not be supporting this South African who's becoming a kind of a superstar in the US. But I've always found him a little reductive, a little boring, a little mediocre, I have to admit. And kind of this is just really confirmed that a little bit, kind of, and also just a kind of this kind of feeling that, I think all of the China Africa watchers, we're reacting to this in roughly in the same way, being like, oh, this is very distressing to see all of these wrong takes and this kind of wrong information, kind of being kind of circulated. My take was a little bit like, we're in that kind of like phase of the kind of US-China conflict, where I think truth is really in the second or third seat at the back. Kind of like no one cares whether any of the stuff is true. They just care about talking points. And he seems to have really kind of like moved into that space, which is a bit dismaying, I have to say.
Well, let's take a listen to some of the highlights of the 13-minute segment that ran on YouTube. It wasn't a segment for the show. It was an online segment only. And so far, as of this recording, it's received about 1.4 million views. That is no doubt going to go up. It's been steadily going up. Let's take a listen to, again, selected highlights from Trevor Noah's Why China is in Africa. If you don't know, now you know.
Think of all the jobs that these projects create in Africa. And it is true. These projects do create jobs. It's just that many of those jobs are going to China.
In Africa, China's estimated to have won almost half of all engineering procurement and construction contracts. But those contracts haven't come without controversy. the country's been accused of unfair labour practices in Africa, including bringing in its own workers instead of hiring locally.
The steady influx of Chinese companies and workers have fueled accusations that wealth and opportunities are not being shared with the local community.
We all do the railway work, but the Chinese constantly say we're the boss. We're the ones who run the show.
That's right. When China invests in these projects, they often send over Chinese workers to Africa to fill all the best positions. And even when Africans are employed, they're treated differently, sometimes even segregated from the Chinese workers. And that's wrong. I mean, we need Chinese and African people to spend more time together because of all the hijinks they'll get up to. I mean, we haven't had a rush hour sequel in like 20 years, guys. So China is gaining control over Africa's foreign policy and its best jobs. Not to mention, a lot of these projects put Chinese companies in charge of Africa's prized natural resources, especially precious metals, which is super important because those precious metals are in basically every piece of advanced technology these days. I'm talking everything: cars, appliances, Elon Musk, everything. So when you start to examine this relationship as a whole, it actually starts to look a lot less like a loan and a lot more like a new kind of colonialism. And that's before we even get to what happens if the loans aren't repaid.
Analysts have accused them of debt colonialism. There are fears China is making loans it knows states cannot repay.
Beijing may engage in what critics characterize as debt trap diplomacy, lending designed to force countries into handing over land, minerals, and strategic assets when they default on a loan.
Ah, yes, the debt trap. It's like the thirst trap of infrastructure. China's just strutting around with its railroads hanging out. What is Africa supposed to do? Not hit the like button? I mean, say what you want about European colonizers, but at least they were upfront about it. Right, we're taking all your and if you don't like it, you can go to the UN. Oh, wait, they don't exist yet. Biatch! But what China's doing is a lot like terms and conditions. Yeah. They know Africa can't afford not to take the deals that they offer. And then, when Africa can't pay it back, the Chinese are like, right, we're taking all your and if you don't like it, read the fine print, biatch!
You know what's so kind of like annoying about this is that you know, our work has shown a lot, and you know, kind of other people's work has shown that that in some kind of ways African governments are actually a lot more successful in allocating work, you know, kind of like work on Chinese projects to African workers. You know, kind of so we recently did at SIRE, we did a comparative research project looking at Chinese you know, kind of infrastructure projects, comparing between African infrastructure projects and Southeast Asian ones. And we found that African governments have been far more successful in actually in allocating the vast majority of jobs on these projects to African workers compared to Southeast Asia, where there's frequently a lot more Chinese workers being imported to do even low-level jobs. So in a weird way, he just like strengthens all of these stereotypes of African, Africa being a basket case, or like being so weak at governance that, you know, kind of that outsiders just kind of run roughshod over these countries. You know, like those kind of stereotypes being strengthened from a place of misinformation by an African just sucks. It just sucks.
Well, and that's a good point, because the fact that he's South African and the fact that he's a comedian, he's not the New York Times, he's not part of the traditional Washington Beltway clique who's been propagating a lot of this for a long time, it makes it that much more credible. And it just seeps into the body politic so much more. And what was impressive, with a lot of people noticed, was how efficient he was in compacting all of the misinformation of the past 10 years into such a short space. And it was interesting how the producers took very selective clips from news reports that validated it. Again, a lot of it misinformed. And a lot of it's just, again, you hear me struggling for words, because genuinely it's just depressing. Do you know what I mean? And Deborah Browdigam has expressed this over the years as well, that she keeps pushing forward and sometimes feeling like, you know, pushing that boulder up the hill and never really getting there. That you don't feel like the discourse in the U.S. is making any progress. And in so many ways now, the discourse in the U.S. feels comparable to what the discourse is in China. And in China, there's a party line. And if you don't adhere to that party line, then you're expelled from that. There's very little diversity of thought on China-Africa relations in Beijing, in the official discourse in China and within the media in China. And the United States has always prided itself on having, as we've talked about in previous shows, this amazing resource of think tanks and scholars and journalists and critical thought and nuance in the discourse. And yet, we're just not seeing that. And so this is how it kind of manifests. So in the same week that Trevor Noah's piece came out on The Daily Show, there was an article in Politico talking about Somaliland and how the United States should recognize Somaliland as a way to check Chinese growing influence in the Horn of Africa. And they took a quote from Piero Tosi, who is a senior foreign policy advisor for New Jersey Republican Congressman Chris Smith. And Cobus, I want to read this quote to you. As China becomes more aggressive in pushing its debt trap model in Africa, the indebtedness of Djibouti and the transfer of control of Entebbe Airport in Uganda provide it with political leverage in these countries.
Yep.
I mean, there it is. I mean, for those of you who haven't been following the show very closely, the Entebbe Airport story, which was used in the Trevor Noah report as well as evidence of debt trap, simply did not happen. And there's just no evidence to support this. And again, I think this plays to China's interests in the long run, because the more time that we spend focusing on these debunked myths of debt trap diplomacy, the less time we're actually focusing on the problems that do exist within the contracts that AData and the China Africa Research Initiative and others have highlighted in their research. There are problems in these contracts. We know there are problems in these contracts, but yet everybody's focusing on, the little shiny bell over the shoulder, which doesn't mean anything. It's the wrong thing. And so it's absolutely, it's despairing. I mean, there's no other way to say it.
It's very funny for me always to see American think tanks, American press, making moving from this kind of supposition that the US is so completely fundamentally different to China, and that the real problem is that is this kind of massive gulf between the two, when frequently from my perspective in the global south, the really worrying thing is that they're so similar. Is that they're both obsessed with military issues, they both are, kind of very, very insular, they're both on the hook to highly nationalist kind of populist kind of movements within the country. They're both kind of fixated on a kind of a zero-sum game. They both have very little bandwidth to deal with kind of differences between countries in places, kind of like Africa. So that for me is a really scary thing. It's not the thing that, they're so different, it's, kind of, it's one or the other. It's no, they're actually really, really similar, and that's the scary thing.
Well, at least in the context of these kinds of discourses, there are a lot of similarities in terms of how misinformed so much of the discourse is in Beijing, and so much of the discourse now is in the U.S. on the issues of these debt trap issues. Trevor Noah certainly didn't help it, and it's a setback. There's no doubt about it. And I think it depressed so many. Let me just read a few reactions from folks in the community who we follow, and many of you and our listeners will know who these people are. Folashade Sule from the University of Oxford. She said on Twitter, "Wow, in just one clip, Trevor Noah has regurgitated all of the myths, memes, and bad takes on China in Africa. It's a pity. I used to like his show." Kan Yilui, a partner in the Beijing law firm Pinsett Masons, really bad piece from Trevor Noah based on misinformation and very little real understanding of China, Africa, and the BRI. Disappointed to see this from Trevor. Hannah Ryder, CEO of Development Reimagined. I have so much respect for Trevor Noah, but this is really disappointing from the Daily Show team on Africa-China relations and key challenges. So the word that we kept hearing was just disappointment, and that's how I feel as well. I'm unlike you, I'm a bigger fan of Trevor Noah, but this one's hard to get over. So just final thoughts on this before we go on to our year in review.
I think this is kind of part of a bigger trend, which is that I think increasingly both on the Chinese side and on the US side, no one, like there's a lack of interest in dealing with actual African countries, but a huge kind of investment in the rhetoric of Africa in quotes. So this is something that I think one should keep looking out for. It's like one should be very wary when Africa in quotes pop up, rather than actual African places.
Yeah, I want to recommend a conversation that I was fortunate enough to be a part of in last week's Sinica podcast with Jeremy Goldkorn and Kaiser Guo, and I was joined by the incomparable Nsetse Were, and she was just on fire in this show. Cobus, did you have a chance to listen to this yet, this episode?
Not yet.
Okay, it is really, listen to it just for Nsetse's comments, and she really went at the West and in the US and Europe for their disdain of nuance. And I think this is exactly it. So complement your reading of the Trevor Noah clip with listening to the Sinica podcast and what Nsetse had to say. I can't recommend it enough. She's just incredible, and she had some fantastic insights on that as well. Okay, let's get into 2021 is now in the rearview mirror. We're a week away from the end of the year. This is the time when we get together to do this show every year. I look forward to it. It's actually by far our most popular episode of the year as people want to reflect on what happened. There's so much that went down. So when we pick 3 issues, we're not picking necessarily the 3 most important things because there's so much, and it varies a lot depending on where you are geographically, politically, economically in this relationship. So we're just picking 3 topics that stood out to us. Go ahead with topic number 1 for 2021 that stood out for you.
Yeah, it's right on cue. My like third kind of rated one, I think is the announcement that came out of FOCAC that China will send 1 billion vaccine doses to Africa. I think it's really important, but I don't think it's necessarily that important as a game changer to change the COVID situation in Africa. So, kind of that's because we're already in Omicron era, and, the efficacy of Chinese vaccines against Omicron is in question, and some of them have been found to not be very effective at all. So in that sense, I don't necessarily think that these 1 billion vaccines are going to be the game changer that solves COVID in Africa, because, obviously COVID itself is this kind of moving target that keeps mutating. What I think it really is, why it's really more important is that it shows the incredible failure that we've seen from Western countries on this issue, and the kind of compound failures that came from kind of weakness and kind of like self-centeredness, from the governments, complete kind of profit-driven kind of cravenness from the drug companies, and the way that those 2 things work together in order to keep vaccines out of the global south. China saw this gap, it stepped into this gap, it played this game very, very effectively. And in the process, it managed to then sidestep all of the very legitimate questions around China's own, kind of vaccine provision to Africa, not least, kind of that Africa has lagged very far behind compared to other parts of the global south that are more politically, important to China, like Southeast Asia. And also the fact that very little of this provision was actually in the form of donations. Like most of it was actually sold at pretty high prices. So China managed to like sidestep all of those issues, managed to kind of come out, kind of looking like the heroes that was going to like save Africa from COVID, and and in the process kind of like played, I think, the West very, very skillfully.
Yes. So up to date, China has distributed 115.4 million doses. That is according to Bridge Beijing. That right now is the most reliable accounting that everybody has. And you can find that over on the Bridge Consulting website at Bridge Beijing. They have a very, very interesting vaccine tracker. One follow-up point to the Chinese vaccines and the efficacy for Omicron. It turns out that it's not just Chinese vaccines, but it's the AstraZeneca shot that I received, Johnson & Johnson, also Sputnik, all look like they are not very effective against Omicron. Only the mRNA vaccines made by Pfizer and Moderna seem to have even moderate effectiveness. There is a real concern right now, and I have to be honest with you, this is a very personal story for me because I am now no longer protected. And so if the developing world has to start over again with their whole vaccine drive to inoculate people with boosters and whatnot because the shots that we've taken to date simply don't work anymore. That's terrifying to think about. I mean, that is absolutely terrifying to think about. In some ways, then, Africa, the fact that they've been deprived of vaccines up until this date may actually be a benefit because you can put new vaccines out that do deal with Omicron when that is available. So to your point, Cobus, the Chinese 1 billion vaccine donation is questionable now in terms of efficacy. But in terms of the optics, I couldn't agree with you more. It really is putting pressure on the US and Europe and Japan and other G7 countries to be able to step up and to actually do something. And you would think, Cobus, this is, again, maybe I'm losing touch with how the world works these days, but you would think that they would see this in their own self-interest, given that the variants tend to come from the places where they don't have enough vaccines. And I don't understand why Western countries and Japan and Korea and some of the wealthier countries don't see it in their interest to make sure they're flooding the developing world with vaccines. But you're right.
Well, the thing is, they're not even kind of really kind of flooding their own poor regions with vaccines. Kind of the whatever variant of coming after Omicron could come from the kind of vaccinated global south, but it could easily come from Wyoming. It's like these kind of areas where where they have it's failed. They haven't yet, but
But most of the variants have come from South America and Africa and others.
But
so
do we know that really? Because the thing is, we now assume that Omicron came from, quote unquote, kind of from South Africa simply because Southern African scientists were the first reported. But then it became clear that it was already prevalent in large parts of the global north anyway. So who knows where they come from? The thing is, kind of the failure of vaccinations both at home and abroad is the issue. Kind of not only abroad.
So I'm going to put for my topic, which is an adjunct to yours on vaccines, COVID-19 just as a story. And when we talk about the needs in Africa, too much of the attention right now, I think, is being focused on vaccines, when it's in fact non-vaccine COVID aid in many ways is more important. And when you talk to public health officials, especially here in Southeast Asia, the chronic shortages are in oxygen, are in training of skilled nurses who can execute and care for medical supplies, PPE, all of the infrastructure for COVID-19. All of that needs to be done as well. And in many global South countries, here in Southeast Asia, as well as in many parts of Africa, the public health systems are at their breaking points. And we haven't even hit some of the peaks that they had in India, for example, earlier this year. So when we talk about supporting the global South, there is so much more that can be done beyond just vaccines, oxygen being one of the critical resources. And so I'd like to see more of that talked about in 2022. But again, that, as you pointed out, none of this was on the agenda for the most part as any major priority. Sure, USAID and some of the European aid and whatnot, and even the Chinese aid, we're talking about it. But if the Chinese are going to step up next year and vaccines may not be the most effective tool, then other public health support infrastructure is also going to be very important. But COVID-19 was the big story in Africa, as it was everywhere. I think the Chinese, as you pointed out, got a lot more credit than they deserved for their vaccine support and even their PPE. They just happened to be where nobody else was. And I think that speaks more to the fact that the traditional powerhouses in global aid have stepped away from that responsibility, and the Chinese stepped in, but they didn't step in my view, with anything really that significant to affect the outcome. 116 million doses is about 50 million people for a continent of 1.2 billion people. That doesn't change the equation. So I think they're getting a lot more publicity and credit than they deserve. But hey, to their credit, they're there. And if nothing else, this is an optics game. This is politics. And on the political side, I think you've pointed this out. The Chinese came up a winner on this one. But I would like to see African countries to stop being so polite. Your President Ramaphosa, they speak in these vague generalities, okay? They need to start calling out countries and names a lot more. I think they need to be more assertive, more aggressive, and really just start hitting them.
Yeah, I agree. Because what we saw when Omicron launched was open racism from European publications particularly, and kind of there is no way to not characterize the kind of the slapping of travel bans on African countries, while other countries with proven Omicron presence did not suffer from those same bans. There's no way to kind of characterize that as not racist. So what we're seeing here is what was very revealing about the Omicron variant was this knee-jerk kind of racist response from from Europe and the US, and that I think was really revealing, and it's not nearly pointed out enough.
Let's go to our second top story of 2021. What did you have on your list?
For me, the second one was the announcement by Xi Jinping earlier this year that they're stopping coal financing. It's in an earlier we had an earlier conversation with Patreon subscribers in which at that moment I was thinking that would probably be my biggest story of the year, but. I think it's really important, but also its direct effect in Africa is concentrated in a few countries rather than across the entire continent. I think it's really important because it shows a kind of a pivot, kind of towards other kinds of financing, but it raises a lot of questions that we haven't answered yet. We don't know whether these kind of old coal investments that are now being cancelled, whether they're going to be replaced. We don't know whether African governments have the projects ready to go. So it reveals kind of coal and other kinds of like fossil fuel buyers within African governments. And it raises a lot of questions about where Chinese kind of financing for this kind of infrastructure is going to go at a moment when we also saw the announcement of a kind of a pivot towards greater cooperation on green energy transitions. But none of those have been kind of clarified yet. So it raises more questions than it answers. But I think it was a really momentous kind of moment. A real kind of like, okay, the oil tanker is turning kind of moment.
So President Xi Jinping's announcement that he made at the UN General Assembly over the summer really capped a trend that started in the beginning of the year, where they basically had phased out coal financing in Africa, as they have in other parts of the world. This is a trend that's been underway for a number of years. Energy financing for power plant infrastructure and other initiatives in places like Latin America from the Chinese policy banks has been steadily going down for years. So again, this was something that we've seen building up. Xi Jinping's announcement did put an exclamation point on it, and it really confirmed what the data's been telling us. But it is very interesting. The Chinese have been building quite a bit in the new energy space in Africa, but they have been at a much smaller scale than the large-scale oil and gas projects and also the coal projects. Now, hydro is a little bit of a different beast here because hydro does kind of technically qualify as renewable, but it has a very heavy environmental footprint on it. Do you count hydro in the category of new energy?
In pure emissions terms, yes, but it has its own kind of emissions story because what we're seeing due to climate change, we're seeing increasingly kind of volatile rainfall patterns in Africa. So you have a lot of times a lot of stretches of drought during which hydroelectric facilities don't produce the level of electricity they have to, and then floods which kind of endangers hydroelectric infrastructure. So frequently these, kind of they have to be backed up by something else when, kind of in a moment of drought. And that then frequently means that these countries default back to the fossil fuels. So it's not a situation that you build a hydro plant and then it solves your fossil fuel problem. Solar and wind, kind of solve those problems a lot more effectively. What the big question for me is whether African governments can pivot towards renewables quickly enough. Like I think what we see, we've seen reports over the last while showing that how few actual projects are ready to run in Africa, like renewable projects are ready to run, like very few. And I think what this pivot is revealing is a really big failure on the African side to set up a kind of a project pipeline for renewables. Even though we've seen, it's been clear for 10 years that this is where where everyone is heading, you see African governments still doubling down on gas, on oil, on, and trying to kind of eke out that last little bit of profit from that, before the entire world goes up in flames. So, so in that sense, like, there's a real lack of vision and a lack of capacity, I think, on the African side, that is now becoming kind of embarrassingly clear. But, it'll be very interesting to see also whether the state-owned enterprises that were driving all of this conventional power infrastructure in Africa from the Chinese side, and with it, this kind of like financing infrastructure like the state banks and so on, what that's going to be replaced with, kind of because the renewable players in China is a different set of companies. There's other kind of financing involved, and kind of so it'll be interesting to see whether they step up. But then, even more challengingly, I think it'll be really interesting to see whether African governments have anything to offer or to request. What do you think?
Well, if you want to get a sense of what it will look like in terms of what you talked about, the replacement, let me take you to Garissa, Kenya, which is in northern Kenya. That was a region that was historically cut off from the rest of the national grid. Back in 2020, the China Jiangxi Corporation for International Economic and Trade Cooperation, they are one of the big Chinese contractors in Africa. They go by the acronym CJIC if you want to look them up. They're very active in a number of African countries. They built a $122 million US 50 megawatt solar power plant in Garissa. And I think this in many ways is the model going forward. So we've talked about how $2 billion coal power plants in Zimbabwe will be replaced by much smaller solar plants. This is what it looks like. The risk is lower at $122 million rather than billions of dollars. It does play to Chinese strengths in terms of solar panels and whatnot. This is the kind of project that I think the Chinese want to finance going forward. It has an immediate benefit because Garissa now is plugged into the national grid, so you can get an ROI on this. I've heard from some other people that this project in particular has a number of problems with it. So as with most infrastructure projects, it's not as simple as what it looks like from the outside. But the broad contours of this deal, to me, represents the trend of what we're seeing in terms of Chinese energy infrastructure financing in Africa in the tens of millions, low hundreds of millions. It is green. Chinese contractors are building it. So that might be a preview to the future.
Yeah, another data point I'd suggest people look out for is nuclear, and particularly nuclear in relation to Russia. Like we've seen over the last year or two, there's been a lot of activity from Russian like state-owned nuclear companies trying to promote civilian use of nuclear power in Africa, and I think they're getting quite a kind of a friendly ear, and that could complicate this kind of mix of things. And of course, nuclear is a complicated long-term investment, but I think in lots of ways, one that's very attractive to many African governments. So it'll be interesting to see, kind of which other players step into the kind of, the renewable energy kind of field in Africa in the next while.
Well, let's go to my number 2 story for the year, and I'll put this under debt and loans. So to your point about vaccines, how the G7 more or less kind of wrote off the global south and Africa in particular, I've been saying the same thing on the debt issue, and I've just been blown away, just absolutely stupefying to watch how the G20 in particular, but also the Paris Club, the IMF, the World Bank, have not done enough on developing world debt. And the deferrals that they've been talking about, which is the DSSI, the Debt Service Suspension Initiative, only kicks the can down the road. David Malpass, who's the president of the World Bank, he's talked about we need to address the underlying debt stock because a lot of these countries are they're bending under the weight of these debts. There's just no other ways of saying it. We're starting to see the real consequences of the fact that this issue is not being dealt with. And while everybody seems to focus a lot of attention on the Chinese, it is the private creditors, it's the multilateral creditors, everybody is more or less in the same boat on this. There has been no movement for the most part in 2021 on any meaningful debt reform or debt restructuring. And despite the constant pleas from people in the global south that something has to be done, nothing really has been done. We've talked about over the course of the year at the various G20 summits how they talked a lot of flowery rhetoric. They put it in their communiques, but they did nothing. And in fact, at the last G20 summit in Rome, they didn't even address it. And so you can see this is not a priority for Washington, London, and Brussels. It's just not. I mean, they literally copied and pasted the text from the July finance ministers meeting into the summit in the fall. It was a copy paste, and nothing's happening. And so I think that to me was one of the big stories of the year.
Do you foresee major defaults coming in 2022?
I don't know about defaults. I mean, I don't know, like, for example, a country like Ethiopia right now, given the current difficulties that it's facing and the fact that its economy has suffered considerably because of the ongoing conflict, I don't know how they would generate the needed revenue to service their debts. Whether that results in a default or whether the Chinese and other creditors kind of pull back and do restructure the terms, what they aren't doing is they aren't forgiving or relieving any of the debt burden. So they're just kicking the can down the hill. So they're going to be obligated to pay these debts eventually. Again, one of the things that's really stood out this year is why the China Exim Bank is insisting on the repayment of the SGR loans, the standard gauge railway loans from Kenya. And while other creditors have agreed to debt deferrals for Kenya. And we spoke with Andy Mock, who is at the China Center for Globalization. He wasn't entirely sure. Again, these are all independent actors in China. Oftentimes people will assign a lot more coordination between the policy banks, the foreign ministry, the commerce ministry. So maybe there's a reason why the Exim Bank is really forcing this loan to be repaid more than what they're doing in places like Angola and Zambia and others. So hard to see if there's going to be any defaults. What we do see happening, though, right now, and this is what we've been tracking all year now in our coverage, is key African currencies now are devaluing because of the debt. Because they're draining their foreign exchange reserves to repay the debt in dollars. The strength of the US dollar is also impacting the value of these currencies. That's making it more expensive to service these debts. That then is impacting the budget priorities elsewhere for these governments. And there's this vicious cycle now that we're getting stuck in. So whether it's a default or these cycles of cash, hard currency leaving the country to service debts, and then insufficient capital for the economy itself to pay for public health, education, all these new things, infrastructure, because the financing isn't there. I don't know. So, and at the same time, a lot of governments are now going back out onto the Eurobond market to borrow more because they need to get capital. And unfortunately, we're seeing also that they're using those Eurobond loans in some of the worst ways possible, which is to fund the administration of the government.
Yeah, that's bad news.
That is the worst way because that does not generate growth. So that's not like building a piece of infrastructure. That's not building schools. It's paying salaries and things like that. And that is really troubling as well. And so I think I don't know about defaults. I was expecting more defaults after we saw what happened in Zambia in late 2019, I think it was. No, 2020, when Zambia defaulted on a $42.5 million note to Eurobond holders. We have not seen any other defaults since then, if I recall.
Yeah.
So defaults, they've been able to engineer around a default. But all of the other pressures that are building on these economies, on top of the supply chain pressures, so the same pressures that we in the U.S. and elsewhere are facing related to inflation as a result of the supply chain disruptions, Africans and developing countries are feeling much more. So the cost of importing goods has been going up. That's leading to inflation. That's eating away at disposable income. So these are all interconnected.
Yeah, it's really, really worrying. It's like it comes on top of this kind of dilemma that people like Hannah Ryder, for example, has pointed out, is that on the one hand, certain African economies are very debt laden and in danger of debt distress. On the other hand, many of these countries also have a massive financing deficit. Kind of they need financing for many different issues, particularly for infrastructure. So, it becomes this really existential question of like, how does Africa kind of move forward without sinking itself under debt? It's really distressing.
So what is your third and final lowlight of 2021?
It's a complicated one. It's a kind of a compound one, which is essentially FOCAC, the big FOCAC summit that happened at the end of November. It's FOCAC is always a complicated thing, but like this time more than usual. I was really struck by seeing incredibly like China Africa researchers I really respect, both making the case that this constitutes a kind of a withdrawal or a reduction of Chinese engagement, and others arguing that it constitutes an increase in Chinese engagement, and both of them making the case very convincingly. So it's. I think we're still waiting for FOCAC to actually kind of shake out in terms of to understand exactly what it constitutes, but it seems to. At the very least, it seems to kind of show a pivot in the relationship, a kind of maturing is maybe one word, or at least another kind of step of the relationship as it kind of moves into this new decade. And it seems to be setting kind of new parameters for engagement, including, kind of a strong reduction of the influence of previous models that we've seen to be really dominant, and what we tended to think of as constituting the China-Africa relationship. For example, policy banks lending huge amounts of money for infrastructure projects that are then built by Chinese state-owned enterprises in African countries. That model used to be thought of as the entire relationship, basically. Now we're seeing that relationship rapidly kind of like morphing into something new, and FOCAC kind of provided a lot of kind of vague indications of where they're going, but very little yet of what it's going to be. In some ways, it's going to be smaller than it used to be, but in other ways, the number of actors involved is rapidly growing. The kind of level of complexity of the relationship is really increasing, and we're seeing kind of the kind of spaces that the relationship is moving into really kind of expanding across a much wider kind of range of engagement than China had, say, 10, 20 years ago. And I think in many ways, a much wider range of engagement than any other African external partner. So in terms of investment, in terms of trade, China is moving into some kind of new space in relation to Africa that I think both European partners and American partners don't even really have an idea of what that's going to be. And so in that sense, it's like we don't know what it portends yet, but it's clearly portending something. So in that sense, it's this kind of like big mystery that is FOCAC. What do you think?
Yeah, I was surprised by this shift and how the Africa-China relationship in so many ways is evolving much faster than I expected. I didn't expect the sharp pivot at FOCAC this year that we got. And I think in many respects, the FOCAC agenda that emerged, what we saw, does reflect African input into the Dakar Action Plan. There were a lot of African priorities articulated in that. Again, the vaccines being one of them, the focus on private investment, the focus on agriculture and exports. I think those are key African priorities that were reflected in that. Interesting because the week before FOCAC, we saw the white paper that came out from the State Council, which is the equivalent of China's cabinet, which is the highest policymaking body in China. And I think the combination of the white paper, which is a purely Chinese document, no input from the African side, combined with the Dakar Action Plan are interesting reading to evaluate kind of where we are. I was speaking with a Spanish journalist earlier this week and talking about it. And I guess the point that I kind of came to about this was the dynamism right now that's in the Africa-China relationship that we simply do not see in other partnerships that Africa has with the outside world.
Yes, I have to say Africa's relationships with Europe and the US looks dead at the moment, like dead. Like there's no action, there's no inspiration, like they don't even seem to like each other very much. It's like there's all of this kind of high-flown rhetoric about all kinds of initiatives, but that I think most Africans don't credit with that they have any kind of basis in reality. It's like it's really, really moribund, kind of on that side.
And there's nothing coming out of the think tanks. There's nothing coming out of the policy circles. There is no white paper that articulates, here's what we stand for. There's no 40-page action plan. Please do not misunderstand me. I am not saying this to celebrate the Chinese and the CCP and all that stuff. What I am saying is that you can see for yourself that the Chinese are coming to the table in Africa with enthusiasm. And you don't see that coming out of the US and Europe, as you pointed out.
Yeah, enthusiasm and new ideas. Whereas I haven't heard a new idea coming from Washington on Africa for years, actually.
Well, that's it. And that's one of the things that I've been so excited in tracking in the daily writing that we've been doing, which is that it's not only just coming from the central government in Beijing, which the State Council white paper document is. That is a reflection from the central government in Beijing. One of the things when you look carefully at the Africa-China relationship the way that we do is you see a lot of activity and engagement coming at the provincial and at the municipal level. So a lot from Chongqing, from Shanghai, Hunan. I mean, the stuff coming out of Hunan, the frequency of what's coming out of Hunan province is amazing. It really is amazing. There is nothing comparable to Hunan in the U.S. and Europe.
Yeah.
I mean, right now, they're still in the process at the White House of formulating an Africa policy.
Yeah.
So they literally have nothing. And again, they're just continually behind. Just to be clear here, and this is why it's important for Africa to look at what's happening in other regions. It's the same situation here in Southeast Asia. When Antony Blinken came to Southeast Asia, his speech was very similar to the one that he gave in Africa. We don't want you to choose sides. We're not being anti-China. We're not going to talk about China. I mean, it really was just scratch out Africa and put in ASEAN, and you would have had very, very similar. A little bit more emphasis on security out here, but it was greeted in much the same way with a giant collective yawn. And what was interesting was that here in ASEAN, where the Chinese are building facts on the ground, which is the $6 billion railway in Laos, new railways potentially into Thailand, huge new free trade zones. I mean, those are tangible economic initiatives that you can see and touch and feel. So starting next year, in a week, the world's largest free trade zone starts with RCEP, which is a Chinese-led equivalent or alternative to the CPTPP. And you just don't see that in Africa from the U.S. or from other partners. So that, to me, is what FOCAC represented. I think it's a stupid discussion is to measure the relationship on whether it's $40 billion or $50 billion or $60 billion in terms of the value of the FOCAC package. Because at the end of the day, there is not a single other partner, including the European Union, that is bringing that kind of cash to the table in a 3-year time period.
Yeah, no one.
No one. I mean, so we look at Global Gateway, they're talking about 50 billion euros, but worldwide, okay? Worldwide. So that's not just in Africa. These 40 or 50 or 60 billion, however much the FOCAC kind of comes out to, is a dedicated Africa initiative. That's a huge amount of money in this day and age. Again, I say this less to praise the Chinese and more to criticize the others, because at the end of the day, I don't think you talk about the Chinese retrenching from Africa when they're dropping $40 billion or $50 billion of cash for the next 3 years. That's not a retrenchment.
Yeah, I completely agree.
Okay, so my last highlight, very different than yours, and funny, and we do this every year where about 2 out of 3 we totally agree on, and we have more or less in line. Then in our last one, we take a different direction. I think the Democratic Republic of the Congo stood out this year. And I think this was a huge year. And I just noticed this from my daily writing on Africa-China relations. The DRC just came up every single day. And I think it's interesting from a political point of view, from a security point of view, from obviously the resources, the economics, and then the diplomacy. So let's talk about what's happened in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. In many ways, it emerged as okay, you corrected me a couple of weeks ago, and I said it was the most consequential relationship that China has in Africa today. I will modify that. It's one of the most consequential relationships, but it is certainly among the most important. And it has emerged in many ways as a bellwether for future Africa-China ties. And it shows in so many ways what we've talked about with the team from Bloomberg, who we interviewed a couple of weeks ago, how Congolese civil society is asserting itself, how African political leaders are asserting agency in this relationship and getting results. When President Felix Tshisekedi started to push back on the Chinese for these mining contracts, instead of getting a reaction from the Chinese Foreign Ministry in Beijing that was putting the United States at the center of this and the usual fiery rhetoric that comes out, spokesman Zhao Lijian was very accommodating. again, it got a very different reaction. Director General Wu Peng of the Chinese Foreign Ministry, China's top diplomat in Africa, he published a tweet which was fascinating, saying that in the Far East, where miners have been operating illegally, that he said that they will be treated harshly or severely under Chinese law. Again, we don't know if that's true, but the rhetoric is different, much more accommodating. The effort that Chinese mining companies have gone to sway public opinion in the Congo, again, using some very effective propaganda techniques and paid media buys and whatnot, I think it's been effective in some respects. And it has been so interesting to watch how all of these politics are playing out. But the DRC did emerge this year as an absolutely pivotal country. And in many ways, it's because of the cobalt. And that cobalt is become the center of attention in the United States and Europe because of the supply chain for this incredibly important metal that is used to build batteries that power electric vehicles and other electronics. So the DRC for me was an absolutely fascinating country to watch. It's going to be a very important issue going forward in 2022 because of the presidential elections in 2023, where there is this symbiotic relationship between the mining industry and President Felix Tshisekedi and his party for re-election.
Yeah, that kind of puts a real kind of ticking clock on this relationship. So it puts a lot of pressure on Tshisekedi to have something to show, both in terms of reform and in terms of actual infrastructure provision. From the Sikomin deal. It provides a very interesting kind of like timeline to track. I think also the Congo has frequently kind of functioned as this weird like kind of Rorschach test, in which everyone's kind of true intentions get revealed, whether they like it or not. So it is very funny to see, for example, like big outfits like the New York Times suddenly discovering the fact that cobalt is a dirty industry now that the Chinese are so heavily involved in the Congo, even though Western companies have been very complicit in these abuses for many years. And also to suddenly like see this kind of narrative of like, oh, it's Western companies versus Chinese companies, whereas we know that Western companies and Chinese companies have worked together in the past to try and defeat kind of earlier versions of these kind of initiatives to force more refining in the Democratic Republic of Congo. So so it's this kind of like it's kind of another zone, kind of as is the entire kind of Africa-China relationship, where everyone sees what they want to see. So it's really, I think it's the fact that we've been tracking it on such a kind of daily basis. I think that work will obviously continue and will strengthen, I think, in the coming year. And it's so important to do because people are so happy to just believe what they want to believe in relation to the DRC.
So we've got some wonderful shows scheduled in January with some amazing scholars and experts, and that's going to look forward at 2022. But let's get a jump on the new year. And in our forecasting for what's ahead, let's take COVID off the table, because we know that COVID is going to be the most important thing, and how this pandemic evolves, whether the vaccines are effective or not, whether the economy related to COVID is going to improve or not. So let's kind of assume that COVID is going to be the most prominent story of the year and all of the offshoots from COVID. But with that in mind, what is the one story that you're looking for next year to be the most consequential?
For me, my shorthand for this is Africa versus Africa. So what I think, like 2021 has been a year, I think, of a lot of kind of big engagement kind of initiatives with Africa. So we had FOCAC, we had COP26, we had Global Gateway announced, we had Build Back Better World announced. Build Back Better World has a longer provenance, but we saw the kind of new investment of energy into it. Next year, I think both in the US and in China, people are going to be very distracted and very focused on domestic issues, because in China there's the big party congress coming up late in 2022, where everyone is expecting the Xi Jinping to formally step into his third term. And we see midterms coming up in the US. So I think Africa is kind of like actual engagement of Africa is going to fall off the map. What we will see instead is a lot of rhetorical engagement with Africa in quotes, so like, I think the Trevor Noah thing is the kind of first warning shot of what we're going to see a lot more, which is a lot of like fake hand wringing about Africa and like what China's doing in Africa or what the US is doing in Africa, and very little engagement with actual African problems in actual African countries.
I'm going to expand on that, and I think the U.S.-China-Africa relationship is going to be consequential next year, but in part because we're going into what I think is going to be a very tumultuous year, politically, geopolitically, also climate change, and Africa has got to do better, and African countries and foreign policy makers have got to do better at formulating what they want out of each of their partners. And again, we have not seen very sophisticated policies coming from Durko in South Africa or the Kenyan Foreign Ministry or the Nigerian Foreign Ministry towards China. And they're going to have to get smarter on China. There's no two ways about it. Because as you pointed out, Africa is going to continue to fall in priority as the big powers look inwards at their own domestic political conditions, but at the same time as they confront each other geopolitically. So when we talked to Andy Mock, again at the Center for China and Globalization, he laid out his 3 things of what he looked at in the year ahead. I think he said Iran is going to be a big one, Russia, Ukraine is going to be another big one, and then again, he very casually said the reunification of Taiwan, which I was just like, holy crap. There is nothing casual about the reunification of Taiwan. If, God forbid, that should happen, and I say God forbid only in the context that will not happen peacefully, and that will be incredibly disruptive. So as we have these massive geopolitical events that are going to take place next year, politics, economics, climate change, all of it. It's going to be a tumultuous year. COVID's not going to get any better. At least I don't think it will, based on what we know right now. How is Africa going to position itself in that?
Well, one of the I think in relation to COVID and then kind of wider issues, we also have seen this week that the FDA has approved the first oral medication for COVID from Pfizer, I think. Kind of once there's a kind of a big rollout of a pill that people can pop rather than a vaccine that has an expiration date and needs to be kept in a cold chain, that starts changing the COVID calculus in the global south. I think one of the big issues that we're going to be seeing with COVID is not only the issues in relation to COVID itself, but the question, the decisions made by governments not only in Africa but everywhere in relation to how interventionists have to be to impose COVID protocols on their populations. And that I think is going to raise a lot of kind of like issues, like social issues in different countries, not least in the US and China. But yeah, like I really agree with you. I guess the thing is, there's always a question in my mind about whether a lot of external attention on Africa is necessarily always a good thing, or kind of whether there's kind of spaces for African agency when Africa isn't at the top of the headlines, of the global headlines. And I think that's kind of an open question, but it again, like so much depends on the vision of African leaders. And, just as an example, in South Africa, recently it was announced that Shell is gonna do these seismic tests to test for kind of natural gas and oil deposits off the coast of South Africa. It's incredibly unpopular because it is directly impacting on whale breeding grounds and off the coast of South Africa that are crucial to South African tourism. Kind of South Africa makes a lot of money from people touring and seeing whales. We already, so that measure was defeated by a South African court, like a measure to try and stop it was defeated. It's going ahead. And in response, the minister, keep in mind, this is a person who was personally involved in a decolonization struggle in South Africa, called the people who are opposed to shell like colonial forces. So this is a kind of level of vision one has among African leaders frequently. And so, I'm not super optimistic, but at the same time, we're also seeing very interesting kind of green shoots in relation to other kinds of African decision making, like for example, this story which we covered. I didn't see almost anyone else covering it, and I think it's really consequential. Is this deal that was made between a Rwandan company to export dried chili peppers to China, and it's done
$100 million deal. It's a big deal.
Yeah. In relation with it, like it's made with the provincial government in China, and then they're leasing the land in Zimbabwe. So it's that combination of like provincial government in China making a deal with an African producer who then leases and trades with another African country. That dynamic is potentially really a game changer, and it has potential, real kind of potential for interesting kind of development. And so those are the kind of things that happen in the shadows with no one commenting on it. Kind of even as people talk about Africa, quote unquote, kind of left and right, in to prove whatever point they want to prove in a kind of a new Cold War discourse, So that's what I mean in terms of the stuff that's happening in the shadows might be more consequential than the discourse that's dominating the conversation.
And also, let's take into account that next year is going to be a very political year in many of Africa's largest countries. There are presidential campaigns that will be underway in the Democratic Republic of Congo, Kenya, and Nigeria for elections in 2023. South Africa is going to have a vote in 2024, and the political seasons are going to ramp up quite a bit. One of the interesting points that Nsetsewere made in our discussion on Seneca is the continuity of power in many of these countries with relations to their engagements with China. So that is one, and this is what we're seeing in the Congo. It was the Kabila administration that signed a lot of these shady loan deals for Sicko means that the Tshisekedi administration went to revisit. How many of the loan agreements will a new administration in Kenya, for example, revisit? Or will a new administration in Nigeria take a different tact on Chinese borrowing there as well? That's something to keep in mind, and expect that in the presidential campaigns, China will be an issue. Not necessarily a big issue, but we've seen in so many African presidential campaigns and large election campaigns, as was the case in Zambia this year, that Chinese loans were a way that opposition parties used to attack the incumbent administration. So that's something to keep an eye on. Okay, that was it. Those were our 3 issues in review. Our look forward, we're going to have a lot more look forward discussions coming up in January, again, with some of these great guests that we have on the show. We just also want to take this time, as we do every year, to express our sincere gratitude to you for listening and for supporting us and for subscribing to the newsletter, joining our Patreon community. We have a brand new newsletter, though, by the way. We now produce a weekly edition. You can go to ChinaAfricaProject.com/subscribe. And if you don't want to get the daily edition, it's just too much. A lot of people told us that they can't take another email in their box. We then have responded to that by producing a PDF on Fridays that goes out. And you can get a summary of all of the best writing that all of our contributors are doing from across our network in the various cities now that we have editors. So if you want to get a weekly edition, I recommend you go to ChinaAfricaProject.com/subscribe. And by the way, when you sign up for the weekly, you also get full access to the site as well. So you can get daily and you can get weekly. Also, next year, we will be launching our new French and Arabic services. That is very cool. We're so excited to introduce you to our editors who are going to be leading those efforts. And the other thing which we're going to be doing is we're going to be start hosting a lot more live video and Twitter Space discussions with our new editors. And Cobus is going to lead that initiative. So, Cobus, we have a lot to look forward to and a lot to be grateful for this year.
Yes, so much. And I just want to echo your thanks to Ev for all of the support throughout this year, all of the engagement, the friendly comments, the people listening to the podcast. We're so grateful. Like, it's sometimes difficult to forget, or one sometimes forgets that there are actually people listening, kind of, because we end up just like we've done this for so many years. We've recorded, thousands, like hundreds and hundreds of episodes, and it's so incredible now to kind of get or to get this kind of response back, kind of from a community, and to see the community actually and to engage with them in real time. It's incredibly moving and really, really humbling.
Yeah, so we're grateful to all of that, and we're grateful to your support. And if you'd like to continue to support us in the work that we're doing and all of the new team members that we're bringing on board, this kind of independent journalism is so important. It does not fund itself all the way. It needs your support. And so if you'd like to support us, the best way you could do that is by subscribing to the China Africa Project at chinaafricaproject.com/subscribe. Subscriptions start at $7 a month for daily subscriptions, and they go to $15 a month that's $7 a month for students and teachers, and $15 a month for everybody else. And then we also have this weekly. But if that's not for you, we also have our Patreon community as well at patreon.com/China Africa Project. So for Cobus Van Staden, I'm Eric Olander. We want to wish you all a happy new year and a happy festive holiday season for you. And we're looking forward to seeing you in 2022 for another exciting year of China, Africa, and China Global South coverage. Thanks so much for listening and for all your support.
The discussion continues online. Head over to facebook.com/China Africa Project to share your thoughts on today's show. For more information about the China Africa Project, go to chinaafricaproject.com.